We're going to be looking at the question of whether or not fascism can occur here in the United States. And so we're going to go over once again some of the common characteristics, see how they apply and if they work out in the United States or can find their way into the United States. And then do we have systems in place based on our Constitution, based on our form of government, that kind of thing, that would prevent people who might be fascist from actually creating a fascist or totalitarian type of regime here in our country. So let's take a look. It's important to understand, number one, and we've talked about this before, but fascism really can take root in a country during an era of social upheaval, right? When a crisis hits the country or things aren't going well, that's when a strong man, leader can come in, start promising easy fixes for any country, and people start buying into that because they don't believe that their current government can solve those problems. So if we look at what's kind of going on in America right now, right, we've got very high income or economic inequality, meaning the rich continue to get wealthier and wealthier, and the vast majority of the people here in this country, their wages aren't really going up very, very much. Good middle class jobs are going away, that kind of a thing. And so that has become a problem here in this country. Manufacturing, those great middle class jobs that have been around for a really long time, those have kind of been dwindling, going away. They've been outsourced to other countries where they can get cheaper labor. And a lot of the manufacturing processes have been automated, meaning robots come in, computers can do the work of those workers, and so we don't need as many employees. And as a result, you get less and less people working in manufacturing jobs that used to pay pretty well and have good benefits and allow you to buy a home and all those kinds of things. Really are gone for a number of reasons. Number one, they go overseas, and number two, because they've been automated and robots are doing that work now, or computers are doing that work and taking the place of actual people doing that work. We have high student debt. College used to be virtually free unless you went to a really prestigious private institution or something like that. And today, college costs a lot of money, and for people to have access to higher education, which we know is tied to success in this country, there is a lot of financial burden placed on a lot of people once they go to college. So it's not unheard of for someone to have $50,000, $100,000, even $200,000 in debt once they graduate from college and they're ready to go get a job, and that debt will stick around with them for 30, 40 years as they're trying to pay that off. And if you're trying to pay that debt off, it makes it that much harder to then buy a home, buy a car, buy all the other things that you want to be able to do, because you have this constant monthly payment to pay off this debt from education. We have skyrocketing housing prices. It's really, really tough for people, especially here in San Diego, to purchase a home. When the average cost of a home is close to $600,000, you need to have a lot of money in savings, and you need to be making a lot of money to afford just a basic average house. And if you want to live in a nicer area near the coast, here in San Diego, something like that, it's even way more expensive. So it's really tough for people to start to get ahead and purchase a home for themselves. We have a disappearing social safety net, meaning people used to get retirement plans and have that to rely on when they were old and retired. They used to have insurance, and it's getting harder and harder to find a retirement plan, a company that even offers one, build your own, which means you got to save any more money. And money has been cut significantly from plans like welfare and food stamps and all those other kinds of things that really help prop people up during tough times and help them get back on their feet. And then once again, we have that dwindling middle class that has also, if you look, we have a meth epidemic here in this country. And when you look at where the meth epidemics are the strongest, you're looking at these smaller towns that were once built solely around a manufacturing plant. And since manufacturing is gone, those towns are dying. And so there's not a lot for those people living in those towns to do. And as their kids grow up and try to find work, there's not much there. And unfortunately, what happens is a lot of people will turn to meth and other kinds of drugs in the absence of finding something more useful to do, like have a good job that they can support themselves. And it's a way to kind of self-medicate and forget about the worries and some, the problems that they have. So once we understand that when nations are in crisis, it kind of opens a door for a fascist leader or a strongman to kind of come in and take over. We need to start looking at the different ideologies or plays in the fascist playbook that they use in order to gain power and secure some control in the new government. And so we'll look at those next. Ideology is that there is a bit of a nostalgia for a lost, glorious past. A lot of political leaders will talk about where they want to take our country in the future, what they want to do with that future, where they see us going, and they'll talk about that. Others will talk about going back and making their nation a wonderful place again. And they kind of harken back to these vague ideas from some time past when their country was great. And so when we look at people like Hitler and Mussolini, they both conjured images of a long past time when their nations were great. Hitler spoke about a Germany before World War I and before it was destroyed, and it really was probably the most powerful country in all of Europe at the time. And they had a wonderful manufacturing base and an industrial revolution that was humming along and all that kind of thing. For Mussolini, he kind of referred back to the old Holy Roman Empire, where it was kind of the seat of power for not just the church, but that was an empire all on its own. And that region was doing very, very well. And so they kind of harkened back to those times and, hey, we're going to rebuild our countries and make them those wonderful places once again. So if you think about America today, and if we think back, is there a time we may start thinking about, or do our political leaders start talking about times in the past that we need to get back to because we're not doing very well today, but we need to get back to these times? You need to think about, like, what era or time period might we be looking back to? When you think historically back, times have always been a bit of a struggle. I think, you look back to the Civil War era. I mean, that was not a good time. The colonial era, we had revolutions and things we had to deal with. The expansion of the West, those were struggles for people expanding. So I'm not sure what time period some people would have us look back to. And then you always have to think about, when you look back to a time period, well, who was it great for? There were always groups in this country that have struggled and continue to struggle today. And then also, what was so great about that time period if you want to go back to that? What was wonderful about it? Did everybody have access to a good job? Was housing affordable? Could they live what's so-called the American dream, and everybody could go off to college, and college wasn't expensive? And everybody had a job. What was it that made it so great? So you need to start asking those kinds of questions, and really, who was it great for? The next ideology that we can kind of look at or turn to is that they typically scapegoat or find a group, generally a minority group, to use as a scapegoat for the problems of the country. And so instead of looking at the real underlying problems of the country, it's easier politically just to point out a group and say, well, they're at fault. And when we look at Hitler, we know that he attacked and blamed the Jews for all of the problems that were going on in Germany, even though it really was the fact that Germany had been destroyed by World War II, and there was a tough treaty that they had to deal with and pay back war reparations for even getting into the war to begin with, and all that kind of stuff. But it was easier just to say, well, no, it's the Jews. They're the ones at fault, causing us all these heartaches, and we need to get rid of them. Mussolini, in Italy, he attacked the Slavic groups and communists and blamed them, as opposed to them being able to just kind of build an economy that was better and more suited for the Industrial Revolution and things like that. He just ends up blaming some groups. So if we think about, once again, bring it back to the United States and us today, Are our leaders scapegoating anyone, right? Do we blame any particular group for people not having jobs? Do people want to blame a certain group for taking those jobs away from Americans? We have a massive drug problem and we have crime in this country. Do we want to particularly blame any particular groups for causing all of this crime and drug problem in our country, or do we really look at kind of the root cause of the problems? And so there are a number of experts that would say that the problems we have in this country are really caused by, first, globalization. Globalization is when we no longer build everything here, but it's easier to get parts from Africa and send those parts to Asia where they have cheap labor, and we can build and use the labor there to put those parts together, and then we can ship it to this other country to finish it off and then ship it back here. Back in the day, you had to do everything at home because it cost way too much and took way too much time to ship stuff all over the world. And today, with globalization and more powerful and faster ships and different labor forces and things like that, we move stuff all over the place. And so we've lost a lot of jobs in this country to globalization. And as a result, those good factory jobs that middle class workers used to have are gone. We shipped them overseas, or we even automated them. So if we do have manufacturing here, it's easier to get a robot or a computer to do that job rather than pay a human to do that, and because humans get tired and they get injured and they want to go home and eat and all those kinds of things. Well, robots and computers don't need any of those breaks. So globalization has caused some of our problems. Climate change has caused some problems too. When we look at mass migration, when we look at these caravans coming up from South and Central America and Mexico, and we look at all of the people migrating into Europe from Africa and the Middle East, a lot of that is due to climate change. And we may want to ignore climate change, but the reality is those people live by farming. And when the climate changes and they go through these massive droughts, and the droughts happen more and more frequently, they can no longer farm in the same way, and they can't support themselves and sustain their lives the same way. And so what they end up doing is that the only way to survive is they got to pick up and move. And so we get mass migration, and then all of a sudden we don't want people migrating to our country, or Europeans don't want people migrating into their countries because that puts a burden on them. And so it's easy to say, hey, we're going to solve this problem by doing this, but really, these are bigger issues, right? The accumulation of corporate power. As companies get wealthier and wealthier, what do? They pour that money not into their workers who have helped them make that money and give those workers a better life, but what they do is they pour a lot of that money into the government in the form of lobbying, and they lobby the government politicians to say, please give us tax breaks so we can make even more money. Please reduce the restrictions on the environment so we can more easily dump our waste in these places and we don't have to pay for it. So that way we can make more money. And so as these corporations are building more things and accumulating more wealth and power, they spend it on politicians to get tax breaks for themselves and more regulations lifted so that way they can make even more money. They don't hand that back. And these are tough problems to solve. It's much easier to blame a certain group, blame it on them, and get everybody fired up about that. And that's what fascists tend to do. Instead of dealing with the real problems, they just want to blame it on somebody because that's much easier to do. Fascists also have ideology as a bit of a belief in that a strong man or one person can save the country. When we look at a nation facing a crisis, we always look to government to solve that problem. And when a fascist would say that the old system can't deal with this problem, they're certainly not taking care of it, and look at how you're suffering. And then they would point to themselves and say, look, I'm the only one equipped to handle the problems of this nation. I have the answers. The answers are pretty simple and straightforward. And if you give me power and authority, I will take care of this and fix all of this stuff for you. And the reason I can do it is, look, I'm an outsider. I'm not part of the political class. I haven't been a politician. I haven't, been in government and government is already ineffective. So therefore, I've been successful in my life, and as a result, put your faith in me, and I can take care of this for you. So typically we see fascists as people who weren't necessarily part of politics before, they were outsiders, but because they understand the system and the solutions to it, they can come in and fix that for us. And so as long as we allow them to be strong, they can take care of those things for us. Another one is typically they stifle dissent, right? They don't like people who talk out against them. And if we look on the extreme end of stifling dissent, that could be basically getting rid of free and fair elections. You start to persecute people who might vote against you. You intimidate them at the polls so they're afraid. They think they're going to get injured if they go and vote. And so your election isn't free and fair. You've got people who are frightened and don't want to vote for your opponent because they're fearful for their life. When you look at other leaders who want to take leadership or become president of your country, they find themselves becoming assassinated or being executed. And once again, this is on the extreme end, but this happens, right? And then what you also see is the group in power or the person in power will ban other political parties from even being in existence and not even allowing them to have opposition to their political party. On a more moderate end of it, what we do is you see fascists come in and they start to kind of undercut the legitimacy of the media. Well, the purpose of the media is to report to the people and tell the people the truth. And so you can undercut that legitimacy by making statements and calling them untrustworthy and that they're biased and that they aren't telling the American people the truth. You can do those kinds of things, and then people stop believing that the media is actually telling them the truth. So then who do you turn to tell you the truth, right? We want to hold our leaders accountable, and so we have to investigate them when we think they're not doing the job they're supposed to be doing. And so when our leaders speak out against that kind of investigation or being held accountable, that starts to undercut or undermine the validity of those investigations. And so people stop believing that those investigations are accurate and legitimate and should go forward. A lot of times we'll see fascist leaders, they'll verbally attack their opponents, call them names, disparage them, bully them, make fun of them, show them that they're weak in some way. And so they're not really targeting their policies. What they're targeting is them as a person and their personality, and they're so weak they can't possibly become, a leader. And then what they'll also do is they'll say, well, they disagree with me, so therefore they're unpatriotic, and paint a picture that these people who may disagree are not patriots and don't have the best interests of the nations, and that they do hate democracy or they hate our nation or something like that. And so those are more moderate because you're not out trying to kill somebody or actually intimidate people, but you kind of are, right? You kind of are to some degree, but it's a little bit more moderate. So you got to think about, does that happen here in the United States? And that's just something, a question you should be asking yourself. Another fascist ideology, ritualistic communal bonding, right? And basically what that means is holding mass rallies. And when we look at Hitler, he held massive rallies, and hundreds of thousands of people would show up in these big stadiums, and they would all chant slogans, and it was very carefully choreographed. Hitler understood really well the power of kind of the idea known as groupthink. And you may think differently, but everyone else around you seems to be thinking in a different way, and then you eventually take on the same ideas as the rest of the group because you feel a part of that. It seems very powerful, and you don't want to be set apart or seem different from that. And so Hitler had these wonderfully choreographed rallies, heavily staged lighting to set him apart and make him seem even more like an imposing figure, big theatrical effects to make it seem more awe-inspiring. He had all of those. And what these rallies really serve to do is there are always enemies that these leaders have. But when you hold these rallies and you get people emotionally to buy in, those enemies of those leaders become the enemies of all these other people as well. And so it's a way to turn the population against certain people. Once again, they're very emotional, and part of this groupthink is everybody's on board, everybody gets caught up in that, and then they all start thinking the same way. And what's unfortunate is a lot of time the rhetoric that these leaders use to whip everybody up into a frenzy is usually less based on fact than it is on emotion. So a lot of times they're not necessarily telling the truth, but they're telling you what you want to hear. It sounds great. They use simple catchphrases. Those catchphrases are very easy to chant, and make it easy for people to kind of remember those things. And so it continually gets people on board with the message that those leaders want to have. And once again, those messages may not be true, but they're very easy and simple for a massive crowd to remember and to get on board with. And then finally, if we think about it, fascist ideology also is about the glorification of the military. A lot of times they want to show off how strong and powerful of a nation they are, and look at these wonderful weapons that we have, and they'll hold these massive parades. Hitler would have his troops marching through the streets and showing off the new tanks and the Panzer tanks and all these kinds of things that they had with flyovers, with airplanes, all that kind of stuff. Same with Mussolini. And if we look at more modern versions of that, we have Putin in Russia, with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, Xi Jinping in China. They all hold these massive military displays to show all the wonderful missiles and the powerful might that they have, to show that they're a very powerful militaristic nation. They're glorifying that, and showing how wonderful they are because of how strong they are. So when you think about, do we do that here in the United States? Do we honor our military? Clearly we hold parades. Veterans Day, Memorial Day, we have parades honoring our military. When we go to Padres games or Charger games or any sporting event, right, we stand up and we sing the national anthem. We usually do a salute to the military or something like that. At big games, we see military flyovers, all those kinds of things. We have veterans stand up and we all applaud and take our hats off and all that kind of stuff. But you have to ask yourself, when we do those kinds of things, are we glorifying the military and how powerful and strong and wonderful we are? Or are we honoring those who serve in our military? And there's a difference between glorifying the military and showing off versus honoring those who serve and saying thank you to those who have given their lives or whatever it is. So there's some different things kind of going on there. Next up, what we'll talk about in part 2 is some of the different things that we have possibly built into our system that can make it really difficult, if not prevent, a fascist leader from not necessarily getting voted in, but from taking over and kind of instituting that fascist ideology within our system of government here in the United States.